So I want to thank everybody for coming and welcome you. And thank you also for the work that so many of you do on these issues. Our panel today is about harm reduction. My colleagues here from the Center for Economic and Policy Research will examine and explain a particularly harmful policy of the world's most powerful financial institution, the International Monetary Fund. It's called surcharges. These are additional fees that the IMF collects from some borrowing countries added to the regular interest rate and service fees. Our panelists will show how IMF surcharges harm people in some of the most vulnerable and debt-stressed countries in the world, and how this interacts with instabilities in the global economy today, such as the increasing burden of their debt service. This is especially true in the past 2 years, as the US Federal Reserve has raised policy interest rates 11 times. This helped push developing countries' interest rates up by nearly 8 percentage points, which is huge, as well as increasing the cost of borrowing in dollars, since the vast majority of countries saw their currencies depreciate against the dollar. And this is at a time when the global economy is facing projected economic growth over the next 5 years that is the worst in decades, as well as the growing burdens of climate destruction and the costs of transition away from fossil fuels. The harm reduction needed here is very clearly for the IMF to abolish these surcharges, which could easily win a majority of the 190 countries that are members of the IMF. But there's a problem. We need the US government, represented at the IMF by Treasury, to agree. And so far, at least, they have not. How is it that one government, and here it's really one part of one branch of one government, how is it that they can make the decisions for a multilateral organization of 190 countries? Much of the answer to this lies in the unrelenting weight of history that defines this so-called institution of global governance. The IMF was created in 1944 when much of the world's population did not yet live in independent countries. And the United States had emerged from World War II as the preeminent industrial power, accounting for over 40% of the world's manufacturing output. As a result, the US government had the predominant role in making the rules of the post-war order, including the rules which put them in charge of the IMF. Remarkably, that non-accident of birth for the IMF is with us to this day. The US has a formal veto over the most important IMF decisions, which require an 85% vote. And the US share of the votes is bigger than 15%. And for almost all other decisions, Europe votes with Treasury, which gives this alliance of high-income countries the same authority with their 60% or more of the vote, the same authority that they had, led by Washington in 1947, when the IMF began its financial operations. And all this despite the fact that the US now accounts for about half as much of the world economy as it did in 1950. So how can surcharges be abolished in this situation? Here we can look to more recent history. In 2021, Treasury allowed the IMF to approve the largest ever issuance of special drawing rights, of which 209 billion, not including China, which cannot use them, mainly because it has 3 trillion in reserves. 209 billion went to developing countries. This is the biggest thing that developing countries have gotten from a multilateral organization, or really anywhere else for that matter. And it was more than all development aid for that year. And unlike most climate aid, as we'll see, and much of development aid, it came with no debt and no conditions. So special drawing rights are an international reserve asset created by the IMF. They're convertible to hard currency, such as dollars and euros. And this issuance by itself saved an estimated hundreds of thousands of lives in developing countries. The whole episode showed that the US Congress, and I want to again thank people here, the US Congress can play a pivotal role in moving Treasury and therefore pushing the IMF away from some of its calcified, decades-long harmful traditions in ways that can change the world. It also helped that more than 100 organizations joined this fight, some representing tens of millions of Americans. There's another effort right now, actually, to get into issuance, as some of you may know, and regular issuances, which have growing support, have the potential to change the IMF over time. Reforms of this magnitude could move member governments to take a more active role within the IMF if they see structural change as possible. And this has very big potential. You know, one of the biggest inequalities in the financial system is what happens when there's a global economic downturn, and the high-income countries are able to use counter-cyclical macroeconomic policy to soften the blow and to get out of it. And the low-income countries aren't. The United States, since the Great Recession, had $10 trillion worth of quantitative easing and had zero interest rates for 7 or 8 years. And when the pandemic recession hit, we ran deficits, record ones, really, 15% of GDP in 2020 and over 10% in 2021. And the developing countries can't do that. So this was a huge change because it lessens some of the gap between these two groups of countries and this great injustice and inequality that happens in a global economic downturn. The surcharges, as we see, are much smaller, but they're an extremist form of this inequality that is supported by the IMF, and it is actually instituted by the IMF. So they bring in very little revenue relative to IMF resources, despite that they are large enough to cause serious harm, as we will see, to the countries that pay them and the people who live there. So this should be winnable. A better world is possible.
Thank you, Mark, for that introduction. We will now watch a video where our speakers go into more detail about this issue.
Okay, let's talk about surcharges. Surcharges are like those fine print junk fees that you find in your credit card, but in this case, for entire nations. When countries ask for a loan from the IMF that is a little bit larger than usual, they have to pay a higher interest rate. This is not the publicized headline rate, but a hidden fee that is charged in addition to the regular interest rates. This isn't even a penalty fee. It's for regularly paying back your loan, but still you have to pay these surcharges. So it's very similar to those small print in the credit cards that we find, in our common day-to-day lives. Another issue that perhaps you haven't heard about is the fact that recently, the US Congress passed a fairly sizable package of financing for Ukraine. But what you probably don't know is that a large chunk of that funding goes back to the IMF because they have to pay surcharges. They have to pay these extra fees to the International Monetary Fund that has been giving loans to Ukraine, and now Ukraine has to pay back, but with these extra higher interest rates. Another issue that's perhaps important for you to know is that surcharges are contributing to unstable Ponzi financing of the most indebted countries in the world, to the IMF, which is supposed to be a bailout fund, a fund to help countries recover economically, to help them get out of a financial or balance of payments crisis. They're supposed to receive this foreign exchange so they can buy necessary imports to promote the state of the economy. But by charging them these extra fees, what you're actually doing is contributing to the crisis in the sense that it will get worse because more foreign exchange leaves the country as they have to pay that to the IMF. And at a second layer, more resources that could be used to finance the recovery of the economy, spending in health and education, in public investment and infrastructure, is instead used to pay the IMF for these surcharges. This has historical precedents. In the 90s, there used to be surcharges, but they were penalty fees for countries that hadn't been able to pay on time. And the IMF itself concluded that it was unreasonable to charge these extra fees. It so happens that maybe they forgot, and now in the 2000s, in the 21st century, they are now again charging these extra fees, and countries are, of course, having a very difficult time, and prosperity in those countries is being threatened because the recovery is made much more difficult because they have to pay these extra fees. For example, the most recent IMF loans, including to my own country, Ecuador, implies that with surcharges, now Ecuador has to pay the IMF an interest rate of 8% per year. This is higher than the interest rate that Ecuador pays for loans to China. Remember that they say supposedly China charges high interest rates for their loans. Well, their loans are on average around 5% per year. But in this case, the IMF is now charging over 8% per year, right? So we have to fix this situation because the IMF can't be charging a higher rate than what others can get with bilateral loans, with bilateral relations. Now, the IMF has many excuses for charging these high interest rates with these hidden fees known as surcharges. But in reality, it's about profits. It's about having a surplus with the IMF accounts at the end of every year. And they say, look, we need to have enough of a buffer with this extra income so that they can have what are called precautionary balances, which is just a euphemism for having excess capital. Recall that the IMF is not a corporation. It cannot go broke. In fact, it depends on quotas that each of the countries in the world pays into the IMF. So there is no lack of funding. There's no lack of money in the case of the IMF. They have over $1 trillion in firepower, and they have much more still available in their current finances. So they don't need this extra income. However, they justify this because, of course, they want to show that they have supposedly good results at the end of every year. But it does not make sense that the extra income or the profits or the surplus of the IMF depends on the most vulnerable, the most indebted countries that are in a weak financial situation and that are supposed to actually get support from the rest of the international community. But even now, given all this, the IMF has recently reached the threshold for what it calls strong finances, with a floor, with a threshold of what they needed in terms of what they call the precautionary balances. So these buffers have reached over 25 billion SDRs, which is over $30 billion. So they already have enough. They've already reached their target. So why keep charging surcharges to countries that are in a vulnerable situation? There are no more excuses, and it's the time to eliminate surcharges altogether. The IMF, unfortunately, is not taking a direct move to get rid of these surcharges. They now want to shift the goalpost, move the goalpost again. And they're saying, oh, no, fine, sure, we've reached the precautionary balances target, but now let's use surcharges for other purposes. No, That's not fair. That is not legal certainty for the international community. They're moving the goalposts, and now they're saying, oh, now we could use perhaps this extra income for some other thing. No, that is not correct. That is being unfair to the countries that have had to make sacrifices to play with the rules of the game that were there before. And now they want to come up with new rules for using surcharges instead of getting rid of them after the threshold has been reached. That is not fair at all. And we need to pass legislation, in this case in the United States Congress, that gives a mandate to the Treasury, which is the entity that represents the US government at the IMF. Why is this very important? Because the United States has veto power within the IMF. It is the most powerful country in the IMF. And if the United States has a mandate to get rid of surcharges, it can join forces with the poorest countries in the globe, from Africa, from Latin America, from South Asia, that are paying these hefty fees, and can get rid of them once and for all. This is the key to the issue of surcharges, and I hope we can count on all of you to get this legislation passed and support a huge relief in terms of debt servicing to one of the multilateral institutions, which in this case is the IMF, and show the way of how other debt relief initiatives can actually happen in other arenas. Thank you.
Sovereign debt is the debt that governments hold, and it can be an important source of development finance, and countries can use it to make important public investments. Countries can borrow both domestically and internationally in foreign currencies from other countries or from institutions like the International Monetary Fund and multilateral development banks, as well as from international private investors. In the decade following the 2009 global recession, developing countries significantly increased their borrowing, mostly because of favorable monetary conditions like low interest rates in wealthy countries, as well as demand from private investors. Global economic shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic and the US Fed's increase of interest rates in 2022 have caused capital flight, exchange rate volatility, and have increased the unsustainable debt burdens in developing countries. Now, nearly 80 countries are in or at risk of debt distress, and the high payments that they make to creditors as a result of the high interest rates and their debt burdens really take a large portion out of their budgets, which means that they can't allocate their scarce resources towards public services like infrastructure, healthcare, and education, and they can't make the necessary investments into preparation and adaptation for climate change, for climate mitigation, as well as other sustainable development goals. External public debt is denominated in US dollars and other foreign currencies. It can be particularly difficult for developing countries when it reaches significant levels because it cuts into their international exchange reserves, which means that when they're making very high debt payments in foreign currencies, they have less exchange reserves to be able to pay for important imports like food and medicine. And it can also threaten balance of payments crises. External public debt is also a problem because countries aren't able to restructure domestically, which leaves them with few options for resolution when they do approach crisis or are in crisis. Debt has become a cyclical burden for developing countries, especially in the context of the climate crisis. So nearly 80 developing countries are in or at risk of debt distress, and the majority of them, over 60, are highly climate vulnerable. Climate disasters are becoming increasingly frequent and expensive. Developing countries don't have the capacity to properly respond to climate disasters as they occur, for example, to hurricanes or droughts and crop failures, including long-term effects. And so they're often forced to to take on higher debt burdens in order to finance the response to climate change. And in addition, the climate finance that's provided by wealthy countries is actually mostly in the form of loans, which means that it increases the debt burden in developing countries. Developing countries that are climate vulnerable and highly indebted also face poor borrowing terms on their debt, including higher interest rates due to their vulnerability. All of this significantly decreases their fiscal space and their ability to spend domestically on important items such as infrastructure, education, and healthcare, as well as long-term goals like climate preparedness and sustainable development. This in turn makes them more vulnerable to future disasters. This also makes them vulnerable to economic shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic and monetary tightening in wealthy countries. In this way, high debt burdens make countries more vulnerable to future climate disasters.
So clearly the Global South debt crisis is a massive systemic problem, and addressing it is going to take massive systemic change. But we are here to talk today about one issue that's actively making matters worse that we have an opportunity to address today. And those are called IMF surcharges. So what are surcharges? As you probably know, the IMF is considered the global lender of last resort. When developing countries are facing an acute crisis, they can turn to the IMF for loans to help them weather the storm. Now, naturally, these loans are not free. You have to be repaid with interest and with additional service fees. This is all very normal. But since the late 90s, the IMF has also imposed these lesser-known fees called surcharges, and these only apply to countries that are heavily indebted to the IMF. So specifically, countries have to pay a 2% level-based surcharge if their debt to the IMF exceeds a certain threshold, and they have to pay an additional 1% time-based surcharge if their debt to the IMF exceeds that threshold for a certain period of time. So I want to be clear that these are not punishments for non-payment. You could be making all of your payments perfectly on time and still accumulate enough debt that you have to pay these punitive surcharges. I think it's pretty clear on the face of it why this is a problem. So you're taking the very countries that are already struggling under onerous debt burdens, that in fact need relief from their debts, and you are punishing them with additional debt. Or as Representative Chuy Garcia said about surcharges, to me, this looks like the business model of payday lenders here in Chicago, not an economic development agency. So in theory, these surcharges are supposed to disincentivize countries from relying too much on the IMF. But in reality, there's already plenty of disincentive to go to the IMF. Countries only go if they really have no other choice. So what they end up doing instead is taking countries that are facing severe economic challenges, adding additional debt to their debt burdens, making it harder to reduce those burdens to sustainable levels, and siphoning off much needed resources that could otherwise be spent on health, on education, on climate action, or on development. Now, this would be a problem at any time, but it's especially bad in the world that we're in that's rocked by multiple global crises, from the pandemic to the global debt crisis to the war in Ukraine and its resulting food and energy price shocks to the climate crisis. And these are all clearly massive global issues that are well beyond the reach of any one developing country. And so as a result of this, just a few years ago, there were 8 countries paying surcharges. These days, there are 22. So it's nearly tripled in just a few years. As you'll see on the map, it's increasingly affecting countries in Latin America and countries in Africa. So what does it look like to be one of these countries? What are some of these countries that are being forced to pay surcharges? To take a look at just 3 of the top 5 most heavily impacted countries. One is Pakistan. 2 years ago, 1/3 of Pakistan's entire territory was underwater as a result of devastating floods. There's a climate crisis-driven natural disaster, and Pakistan has very little responsibility for the climate crisis, and still it's being punished for the debts that it takes on to sort of survive this moment. Another is Egypt. Prior to the war in Ukraine, Egypt relied on Russia and Ukraine for 85% of its wheat imports. So Egypt has really been rocked by these food price shocks. Hunger has increased. They recently had to cut their bread subsidies. And another country that's paying surcharges is Ukraine itself. Ukraine actually pays more in surcharges than nearly any other country in the world. And I don't think any of us here would really think that what Ukraine needs right now is to be punished for having accumulated debt with additional debt. In fact, what this effectively means is that as the US financially supports Ukraine, billions of those dollars are being siphoned off into the IMF's coffers. So this is not just a misguided policy and imposition on developing countries. I mean, it really affects the people in these countries and the ability of these countries to provide for their people. So much so, in fact, that a few years ago, 9 UN independent human rights experts sent a letter to the IMF expressing their grave concern that surcharges impede fundamental human rights. Or, in fact, as Nobel laureate economist Joe Stiglitz said about surcharges go exactly against what the IMF is supposed to be doing. It's supposed to be helping countries, not extracting extra rents from them because of their dire need.
The IMF has imposed surcharges on debtor countries in different forms since its founding, with the justification that they would prevent larger and longer borrowing. But historically, the evidence actually points to the opposite. We now know that on 3 separate occasions over the last 50 years, the IMF has eliminated these surcharge policies because they failed to fulfill their purpose and they didn't work. Additionally, IMF staff have actually admitted that surcharges feature perverse incentives. So instead of encouraging lower borrowing and faster repayment, they actually add to countries' debt burdens and they make it more difficult for them to pay off their loans faster. And so when the current surcharges policy was instituted in 1997, which is in response to the Asian financial crisis at the time, some members of the IMF board of directors dissented, and they warned that surcharges would actually be counterproductive and that they would add to the balance of payments problems that countries were already facing. And we can now see that, this is exactly what's happening today and what's happened in the past. And this is kind of best demonstrated by the top 5 surcharge paying countries, which repeatedly refinance their IMF loans, which are nearing maturity, with new IMF programs, thereby extending their repayment and continuing to pay surcharges into the future. And in this way, surcharges feature an additional perverse incentive in that they act as a penalty, right? It's a policy that penalizes countries for the amounts that they borrowed, which doesn't make sense because the IMF controls and approves large amounts of borrowing. And so essentially, countries are being penalized without having incurred any kind of penalty. The IMF also uses surcharges as another source of revenue to boost its capital base. But it actually doesn't need surcharges as extra income because it has already reached its target for precautionary balances in 2024. And according to its own estimates, even if surcharges are completely eliminated, the IMF would stay above target for years to come. The IMF also has alternative sources of financing, including large reserves of gold, which it still values at 1960s prices. So if it were to value just a portion of its gold at market prices, it would significantly boost its capital base. Up until recently, the IMF failed to provide regular and comprehensive information on surcharges, which made it difficult to calculate how much countries have paid in the past, how much they're currently paying, and what they will owe in the future. In 2023, the IMF did start publishing historical data on surcharges and partial future estimates. But these estimates are still opaque and they're actually much lower than what countries will end up paying. This is because the IMF does not include surcharges payments on future loan disbursements of existing debt in these calculations, meaning that if a country is scheduled to receive a portion of their loan in a future year, the amount due in surcharges on that disbursement is not being included in the IMF's estimates. And so the estimate ends up being quite a bit lower than what the country will end up paying. At CEPR, we include future disbursements in our estimates, and so we provide a more accurate picture of what countries will end up paying in future years.
All right, so surcharges are harmful. They have no rationale. What can we do about it, and why now? Now, for a long time, the IMF surcharge policy really went under the radar, and that was in large part because the IMF was pretty opaque about it. Didn't publish information on what countries were paying surcharges, how much they were paying. But as the pandemic began, as it was clear that this economic crisis was going to increasingly affect developing countries, more and more would be paying surcharges, there was some increased scrutiny. And in 2021, CEPR, in fact, published what we believe to be the first independent estimate of IMF surcharges. Now, since that moment, there's been a massive global call to either suspend surcharges for many years or to discontinue the policy entirely. Now, I've already spoken about Nobel laureate economists like Joe Stiglitz, UN human rights experts, but these calls have also come from the UN Secretary General, the UN Global Crisis Response Group, the G77, which represents nearly every developing country in the world, has clearly called to end the surcharge policy entirely. And then just hundreds of civil society organizations, including those in impacted countries like Ukraine, but also massive global organizations, humanitarian groups like Oxfam, climate groups like 350.org, the International Trade Union Confederation. All of these have criticized the policy and called to either suspend or eliminate them. Now, Congress has also had very important work. In early 2022, a number of members of Congress sent a letter calling to end the policy, which drew a lot of attention. And a few months later, Representatives Jim Himes and Chuy Garcia introduced the Stop Onerous Surcharges Act. The Stop Onerous Surcharges Act calls for a comprehensive review of the surcharge policy and the suspension of all surcharge payments while that review is taking place. Now, that actually passed the House as an amendment to the NDAA in 2022 and was recently reintroduced in the House, this time by Representatives Joyce Beatty and Chuy Garcia. So all of this pressure combined over the course of years has finally led the IMF to recognize that it's time to do something about this. And so in April of this year, the IMF announced that they will be conducting an internal review of the surcharge policy. Now, this is a great win. It's a huge window of opportunity, but there's also a risk that this is really just a box-checking exercise. They know there's a lot of criticism and just want to review it. So it's really up to us to make sure that this is a substantive review that takes seriously the possibility and the need to discontinue the policy entirely. And that's where we come in. That's where members of Congress come in. The IMF's review takes into account stakeholder positions. And there is no stakeholder at the IMF with a greater voice, with more influence than the United States. So whatever is happening in the US, whatever members of Congress are saying, all of this is going to have a great impact on the outcome of this review of the surcharge policy, which is taking place sometime this summer, possibly going to end sometime this year. So that's why we need members of Congress to really do what they can to draw attention to this issue. In the House, that might mean joining on to the Stop Onerous Surcharges Act. In the Senate, it might mean supporting similar legislation or legislation explicitly calling to eliminate the policy. But in general, it also just means making our voices heard, making it clear that it's time to do away with this policy, that we want surcharges to go, making this clear publicly, making this clear privately to the Biden administration, so that together we can make sure that this is not just an exercise in checking boxes, but that this review is meaningful and that we can finally do away with the surcharge policy once and for all.
We will now open the floor for questions. So if you have any questions, please type them into the chat and our panelists would be happy to answer them. I can start with the first question that we have, and that question is, aren't surcharges relatively small in the context of the debt crisis and everything that countries are facing at the moment? And I will ask our panelist, Andrés Arauz, to start with answering that.
Hi, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for the question. No, they are not small because debt service is also usually measured in terms of the total interest that a country pays. And our more recent studies at CEPR, we have shown that surcharges represent between 40 and sometimes even over 50% of the interest interest load of the surcharge paying countries. So it's definitely not a minor issue. Now that we are possibly going to engage in lower standard interest rates from the Fed and other central banks, the rate of charge of the surcharges will be, again, much higher than even the conventional rate of charge. So it also represents a big load and a burden for countries.
Yeah, I could just add on to that real quick. Completely agreed. It's not a small matter. But importantly, obviously much more needs to be done to address the systemic debt crisis. But this is something that can be done right now. I mean, the next few weeks are a window of opportunity to end a policy that is actively making matters worse. It's sort of should be a low-hanging fruit if we're able to take advantage of this opportunity. So even though ending surcharges alone won't end the entire debt crisis, this is something that we can tangibly do right now, and all it takes, no cost, just a single vote of the United States.
Thank you. We have another question here from Tim Herschel Burns. Could you expand on the risks that large IMF shareholders are trying to keep surcharges in order to fund other parts of the IMF, like the PRGT, and the flaws of those proposals?
I'm happy to respond to that one. Yes, so there is some support among the bigger stakeholders for keeping surcharges in place in order to fund concessional instruments like the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. This is very counterintuitive and unfair because it basically takes the responsibility of wealthy countries who should be contributing to concessional financing and places it on countries that are most struggling with debt, right? So why should these heavily debt-burdened, really struggling countries be the ones to increase IMF lending? It doesn't make any sense. And again, it would only protract this crisis. And like my colleagues have already mentioned, the IMF has plenty of funds, with revaluing gold reserves, getting more donations from wealthy countries. They really don't need to depend on the ones that are struggling the most.
Thank you for that. I have another question from David Whitehouse. Do you have any indication from the IMF as to the shape of the possible reform or scrapping of the system?
I can take that. The IMF, the discussions are a bit of a black box. A lot of this goes on behind closed doors. I think, as we mentioned, this is a review that's ongoing, but it's not just a technical review. It's not just looking at the evidence. It's a stakeholder review, right? So it involves speaking to the various different stakeholders, those who are going to have votes at the board, which, as Mark made clear, that really a lot of that comes down to the US, which is by far the largest voice at the board. So they haven't expressed sort of how the discussions are going so far, but we do expect a decision by the October annual meetings. One possibility would be that they might change the threshold. They might, at which point in your debt accumulation, you have to start paying surcharges. Another possibility is that it might change the charge of surcharges, how many basis points you have to pay once you start paying surcharges. But we here really think that it's important to see elimination as the target, as the objective that we should be getting at here. The IMF has not provided any evidence that these surcharges work. There are mountains of evidence that they cause severe harms. So anything short of complete elimination of IMF surcharges would sort of be a continuation of a failed and counterproductive policy.
Yes, I would just add that it's almost certainly going to be decided by Treasury, and that's true. I mean, you can look at the last 30 years of IMF decision making, and you can ask people who work there that long, and there's really only I can count on maybe one hand all the times that Treasury wanted something at the board and didn't get it. Okay, and so that's why it's so important, and why the work that Congress has done is kind of path breaking, because it is holding the IMF accountable in a way that has only happened really a few times in its history. In 1998, for example, Congress attached conditions to IMF funding. You have to go back pretty far usually to find something like what has happened in the last couple of years, but it can definitely be done. It's kind of like, the Progressive Caucus only has 100 members. They don't run the House, but they've done some things, okay? And so it is possible for people that the IMF has to care about, including, ultimately the executive directors from all the countries who are represented there. They do have to, they do have to listen sometimes. And I think that's why I think we're going to win this.
Thank you. We have a question here from Nichinda from Afrodad. What impacts do these surcharges have? Especially what impact do they have on economic development, on countries in the global south?
I can respond to that. Yeah, I mean, these surcharges have not just a direct impact in terms of taking away valuable resources from investment in the local economy, for example, in health or education or extremely valuable infrastructure, but they also are a burden in terms of hard currency, right? Because not only does it take resources from the domestic budget, but it also takes resources from scarce foreign exchange. And that implies that it makes access to technology or to valuable required imported goods from these countries to be also much more difficult. So it hampers and it damages the possibilities of sovereign development by countries of the global south. It's hard enough to find foreign exchange to pay for regular debts. It's much more difficult to find foreign exchange to pay for the surcharges of these regular debts.
Thank you for that, Andrés. I have a question here anonymously, which asks, if countries repaid the IMF on time, they wouldn't have to pay surcharges. So isn't this their responsibility?
I can answer this. No, so surcharges are imposed on countries whether or not they're paying on time. So in most cases, these countries are paying off their IMF loans according to, the structure that's agreed upon. These payments aren't coming in late, they'll have to pay surcharges anyway. And so they're not tied to, whether or not you're doing exactly the right thing. You'll have to pay surcharges anyway if you've reached, a certain percentage of quota. And in that way, I think, like we've mentioned before, it's a perverse incentive, right? Because surcharges are a penalty while countries have not actually done anything wrong.
And I would just add, I'd reiterate the stat that we've used before, the fact that the number of countries that have accumulated so much debt that they are paying surcharges has nearly tripled since before the pandemic. So it's really hard to think of that as the fault of irresponsibility of individual countries. I mean, we're seeing massive global shocks, pandemic, the food and energy price shocks that followed the pandemic, high interest rates in the global north, and climate change. These are massive things that you can't attribute to, spending responsibility in individual countries. So having this sort of punitive incentive is just the wrong outlook and doesn't take into account how this system actually works, why countries accumulate debt, and what will actually help them reduce their debts to sustainable levels.
Thank you. The next question is, what would the IMF do without this surcharges money?
I mean, it's such a small amount of money relative to their resources. I think Andrés pointed this out. They have $1 trillion of firepower. In a way, it's just almost an accounting problem. And, analogy I would give is think of the Social Security Administration in the United States. They pay out about $1 trillion a year in benefits. And they have something, it's kind of like the same orders of magnitude here. But not anymore, it's very close to the same numbers. They have like about $4 billion in expenses for staff and things like that. And so, what if they were having, they needed more money for this $4 billion, and would they cut the benefits of the poorest people in the United States? I don't think they would get away with that. And that kind of illustrates the problem of the lack of accountability of the IMF. It's run by the countries who are not paying any of the consequences of what this policy does. And that's why they have to be pressured. I mean, Treasury especially, the boss.
Thank you. We have a question here from Marcos. Could China become an alternative to the IMF for developing countries?
That's kind of an interesting question too. This came up during the Asian financial crisis because there were proposals, for example, from the Japanese finance minister to create an Asian monetary fund. And, actually the U.S. Treasury, I think he was deputy assistant at the time, flew out to Asia and said no to everybody and killed it. But it could have been a good idea. But one problem was that nobody really wanted that job, and I don't think China would want and necessarily they could come to an agreement for China to be the IMF, and could they come to an agreement for all the countries to have a multilateral lending institution for Asia that took care of countries with balance of payments or fiscal crisis? That is a possibility. That was really discussed seriously in the, I think it was 99 or so. And, but yeah, it's not going to be China as a country. They wouldn't want to even think.
But I would add that we've seen Chinese lending, though it's dropped off in the last few years, has increased and is playing a much more significant role in the global system. And that if Western countries were looking for a way to push countries into the orbits of other lenders, surcharges would be the way to do it. Having these sort of exorbitant fees that are clearly damaging for those who take them on just adds to all the evidence that many developing countries already have that the IMF is not looking after their interests and that they should be looking for lending elsewhere. So if you were trying to push borrowers into other countries' orbits, surcharges would be the way to do it.
Okay, thank you all for the questions. We will now move to have our panelists give us some closing remarks.
Yes, I would just like to advertise that in the next few days, we're going to be launching a surcharges dashboard, which will have graphic representations of all of the countries that have paid surcharges since 1997, and you'll be able to, sort it by year, by country to find exact data. It will also include CEPR's estimates. You'll be able to see all of the countries paying surcharges this year, what we expect them to pay over the next 10 years. And I hope that it will serve as a resource for other advocates in this area, and that, we'll all be able to use it to demonstrate further just how harmful surcharges have been in the past, and the burden that they continue to be today. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say thanks everyone for coming. Just want to emphasize that the window to end IMF surcharges is right now. After this review, it likely would not come up for discussion for many more years, which means that billions of dollars for Ukraine to recover and reconstruct from this war, for Ecuador to protect its rainforests, for Egypt to feed its citizens, for climate vulnerable countries like Barbados and Pakistan to respond to the climate crisis. This all comes down to a single cost-free vote from Treasury, and therefore to whether or not members of Congress and constituents across the US are able to make their voices heard on this issue in the next few weeks.
Yeah, I also would like to thank everyone for joining. And do remember that you can act here. We have shown surcharges should be eliminated. I think we've seen plenty of evidence. There's also historical precedent, and this is a really important point that Ivana made, that it's not like it's going to be the first time that the IMF has gotten rid of surcharges altogether. So there is historical precedent. And in fact, for the exact same reasons that we're discussing now today, they got rid of them in the past. We've also shown the target has been reached, so there's no need to continue charging countries this huge burden. And we have shown that it is not a disincentive, that it's merely a burden. So there's no reason to continue with these surcharges. The US Congress shouldn't buy the IMF's arguments. We should get that legislation passed. Just as its constituents want to get rid of junk fees, so do poorer countries like mine. We want to get rid of these surcharges.
Is it my turn? Well, I think you all summed that up really well in terms of the cases been made, and it's time to do it. And for how important the Congress is. And we have this problem on macroeconomic policies generally. This isn't even traditional macroeconomic policy, but it has that impact. It harms these countries. And people don't realize, the role that this plays, even in the United States, for example, but in the rest of the world. And this actually does bounce back to the United States as well. As in the case of the SDRs, we're seeing that the $1 trillion of imports that developing countries, not including China, import from the United States are responsible for millions of jobs in the United States, actually, and the difference between having an SDR issuance and not having one can make a difference of a couple 100,000 jobs here. And of course, this doesn't destroy, harm the world economy the way the lack of, or even the pro-cyclical policies that the IMF has prescribed historically, but it hurts. It hurts everyone, and it makes it more difficult for these countries to recover, and it can cause very serious crises that lead to political problems as well, very serious ones. So this is something that it really is a great thing to have the Congress involved in this. Otherwise, we would have no accountability here.
Thank you. We have also posted some resources that might be useful to you that the panelists here at CEPR have worked on, and those are linked in the chat. What we've linked is our most recent and updated estimate of surcharges, a complete case for their removal, a quick fact sheet that gives you everything you need to know in a 2-pager document, and the latest report that looks into the historical precedent of decisions around policies such as IMF surcharges. Thank you very much to our speakers and to all of you for joining us today.
Thank you.